Very valuable they were, worth a mint of money, said the old sailor, sitting in the corner of the bar. I suppose it was our mutual distance from the sea that drew me to the ship. Wrecked on the top of a veneered sideboard in a dark corner of the last antique dealer left in Thame, it spoke of a different world, one from which we had both been exiled. This sturdy vessel was no fair-weather schooner. High-sided, broad-decked, it was a fat, serviceable little ship resembling a woodcut of one of those busy cogs, the tubs that had supplied the Spanish Armada and foundered with all hands. Like me, it must have known rough grey seas, the kind of water I'd swum in every day as a child. When I picked the old thing up and turned the oak hull in my hands, I felt again those waves that come just after a storm, when the sea is full of churning bladder-wrack and blinding, upbraiding sand. And yet I remembered also the kindness of the sea, for it is warmer than rain, so that the shrinking body ducks down into the salty soup, away from the icy downpour above it. Yes, the ship and I, we'd both been through fair weather and foul. Mostly foul. And here we were, marooned inland, with never a smell of salt water. I turned it round in my hands, and found the words Tiger, Plymouth, in faded red paint. "Someone just brought that in," said the shopkeeper. "Don't know where it's from, not round here anyway. Let you have it for 45. "Absolutely not." I laughed to show I didn't intend offence, put it down, and walked around the shop to demonstrate my indifference. The showcases of 1950s decanters and tinny bits of 1930s silver had nothing for me, and I couldn't pretend that they did. I walked back to the Tiger and looked at her again. She still had some of her rigging, cables of soft thread draggling from the yellowed pocket-handkerchief scraps of sail. We settled on 30. I had little intention of restoring it. This wasn't a toy. The black oak was too solid. The tiny planks of the deck were firmly nailed down, and there was something expert about the remains of the carving, the few flourishes around the poop and the rimmed gun-ports. No, leave it as it was, a wreck, but one with some dignity. But where to put it? I had no wish to put it once again on some flat, solid surface, which would only emphasize how far it was out of its element. After some consideration, I had an inspiration. I fetched a ladder and hung it in the air, in the way you sometimes see models of ships suspended in the churches and cathedrals of seafaring cities. If I couldn't give the Tiger its natural element, at least it would not be grounded on dry land. Standing back from the ladder, I approved of my decision. The ship made a dramatic and effective little piece of theatre, the black lines and spidery rigging outlined against my white-painted walls. Ah yes, that rigging. But even now, I can't hate my ship. There was an understanding of its wretched landlocked plight, something indefinable but based on distance, memory, and longing, and something of that is still with me, after everything that happened. Nothing happened for a few nights in any case. The ship swung from the ceiling, moving gently with a slight breeze when I opened a window, and I congratulated myself on the illusion of a breath of life in its weary sails, as if a battered old marine warrior was drifting on the tide. I certainly didn't find it disturbing in any way. One still June night, however, I looked up from my armchair, distracted by some tiny shadows that seemed to be flickering on the wall. Glancing towards the suspended ship, I saw that there seemed to be some movement in the rigging caused by a tiny, crawling mass. My immediate thought was that an insect had become trapped in the threads. I fetched the ladder, climbed up with a duster in hand, and found nothing. No struggling spider caught aloft, no fly trapped in the shrouds. The shadow on the wall had vanished. I forgot about it, till the scenario was repeated a few nights later. Again the sense that something was struggling in the rigging, but this time a question came into my mind. I'd thought it was struggling to get free, but perhaps it was trying to cling on. This seemed somehow an unpleasant idea, even though, as before, when I got up close, there was nothing on those pathetic threads. After this, I found I was deliberately glancing up at the ship from time to time, to see if anything was moving. I began to see those movements with greater and greater frequency. Something with legs, like a trapped insect, was waving them about, sometimes inching up the ropes, then falling back again. It seemed to make no progress. The complex tangles of threads began to seem like a spider's web with prey in its grasp, and yet there was purpose in all its swaying operations, as if all the time it was forcing the insect, or whatever feebly waving creature clung to the rigging, in an upward direction. Every time it tried to climb downwards, to inch its way from one wooden bar to an inferior one, or to reach a lower level of the oaken pencil shape that stood for the great mainmast, the threads parted or swung before it, so that it had to climb sideways or upwards. All this was reflected by the shadows which were cast on the wall behind, so that it was difficult to avoid, and I found my eye constantly being drawn by the tiny motion. And sometimes, when it slumped upon a tiny spar, as if it were giving up hope, that my thoughts were creating absurd imaginary responses. "Go on," I'd find myself saying. "Don't give up. You must get down somehow." The thing began to prey on my mind. I had few friends in the dull Midland town, and seldom left my flat, since for the greater part of the week my accountancy work could be done at home, though I had to appear at staff meetings a couple of times each week, so I couldn't live too far away. After all, work is work, and if you get it, you have to stay with it. Accountants are generally reckoned to be dull persons, and I began to feel that the featureless brown surroundings were adding to my dullness. I'd not been like this, surely, when I lived by the sea, when I looked out all the time on constant movement, ever-changing tides of the sea. How boring land was in its stolidity, its stubborn refusal to alter shape from minute to minute. In a strange way, the model ship became more and more my companion and partner in this, and the miniature scrap of life that sometimes seemed to animate it reminded me of that world where nothing was still, where even when you lay sleeping in a cabin you were rocking and swinging. And, of course, more than anything, the experience when you were aloft and felt that huge exaggeration of the swell in which the masts dipped down almost to meet the water and rose again in great arcs that threatened to throw off any seaman who couldn't cling on with tight enough grip. When had I experienced that? In my dreams? As an intelligent person, I began to examine my own thoughts, and I thought I understood what was happening. I longed for the sea, and it came to me that the ship acted as a kind of touchstone for this. After I'd gazed at it, after any passage of time when I'd seen that tiny thing struggling in the shrouds, I longed for the coast. This desire, this inner urging, began to disturb my work. There were projects I'd not completed, work that wasn't submitted on time. One night, I packed up the ship. The cords and sailcloth hung ragged and blameless, moving only in response to my hand. Yet still I felt that the damned thing was exerting a pull, had some urge of its own. "I know what you want," I exclaimed at last. "You want to go back to the sea. And so do I, but I can't. I'll take you, though. You can sail out to sea again. Sail or sink, if you will." It took about 3 hours to reach the stretch of coast where I'd grown up. When I fetched the ship from the car, I looked at it carefully and realized I was now afraid of it. I walked towards the old jetty that stretched out into the water, picturing, as I did so, the moment when I would launch the little vessel back into the water, when she would start perhaps to float and drift away, bobbing along, bobbing over the waves, with all the time some tiny thing trying to escape from its rigging. The thought seemed horrible. "No," I said aloud on the empty beach. "Rather than that, I'll sink you." Now that I tried to tear its planks apart, the little boat seemed horribly strong, but my determination only increased. "Right then," I shouted, "I'll send you to the bottom one way or another." I fetched a spanner from the boot of the car, picked up a handful of pebbles, and thrust them in my pocket, and then began to wedge the spanner into the miniature deck, and twist it so that the wood splintered and thrust upwards. "Whatever you've got in your hold," I said in a rage, "I'll weigh you down to the depths." The deck broke apart. I found myself staring at what lay underneath it. The cargo this vessel had contained all this time, sealed away through the years, through its passages over the oceans, thence onto the antique shop sideboard, into my home, swinging, hanging there, over my life. It was this last thought that made me feel physically sick, as my mind slowly and reluctantly identified the cargo. Something long and yellowish-white, something now in separate parts that had once been horribly joined together. It was just the length of the hold that lay beneath the deck of the Tiger, fitting neatly there as if the vessel had been built to hold it. It was a skeletal human finger, still with a yellowish-brown nail hanging at the tip. I think I was screaming as I thrust pebbles into the splintered ship, then raised my arm and flung it in an arc out into the waves. Fortunately, the spot was deserted, and anyone at a distance might have thought it was the screeching of gulls. I live beside the sea now, very poorly, but I manage to exist, and its changing moods are a comfort to me, even if I have seen something floating up and down on the waves, just out of reach, that seems to have a poor little insect clinging to the rigging. Who knows? Maybe my pebbles spilled out. Maybe the Tiger will be washed ashore. I talk, sometimes, to the old sailors who come into the pub above the beach, when I can afford a beer now and again. One of them told me about the dead man's hand. Very valuable they were. Worth a mint of money, a drowned man's hand, though there's few as might want to touch one. But if they didn't trust one of their shipmates, say they thought he'd stolen something, or not made a safety line fast when he should, they'd slip him a finger from a drowned man's hand, quiet-like, so he didn't know. Just one finger, that's all it took, hidden somewhere in his bunk, or maybe in his clobber, and then, when he next went aloft, why, he'd never come down again, except one way. He'd find he couldn't climb down the rigging, see? So yes, my little ship had been made as a gift for a shipmate. Someone had sat on deck and carved it in his leisure moments, and then it had been handed over, with something safely stowed below in the hold, and the hatches and decking securely battened down on the cargo. The thought fills me with horror, yet sometimes on a fine day I sit on the jetty and love the bright glittering of the sun on the sea, which I missed so much inland, even though it pains the eyes. And I think how much I owe my return to the Tiger, and how the little boat longed for the salt water.